Chapter 5, July 1st, 1863. Abraham opened his eyes to the pre-dawn chorus of birds outside his window. He got up from his bed and lit the oil lamp on the small table nearby. On it was a well-thumbed copy of a farmer's almanac that Mrs. Lightly had given him. It was a very helpful book. It told of the phases of the moon, the seasons, and when to plant. July 1. Bush or snap beans. Choose at this season a piece of ground in an open situation. Let the ground be well dug and laid even. It was July 1, and he'd already planted his snap beans and had hoped to plant a second crop, but it didn't seem like he'd have time. Then he opened his Bible and read a verse as he did every morning of his life. He turned to Ecclesiastes. To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under heaven. A time to be born, and a time to die, a time to plant, and a time to pluck up that which is planted. He continued to read. He was looking for something, a sign, something to tell him that he was doing the right thing. Wherefore I perceive that there is nothing better than that a man should rejoice in his own works, for that is his portion. His portion? Abraham thought about that. Perhaps what he was about to do was truly his work and would be his portion. He hoped that his decision would please the Lord. A few miles away from Abraham's house, a Confederate officer, Major General Henry Heth, was told about a warehouse full of shoes in Gettysburg. He wanted those shoes for his barefoot men. The rebel army was a walking army, but their long marches had used up the supply of leather, and the South was unable to produce and furnish the needs of their foot soldiers. Heth asked permission to go into town with his men. "If there is no objection," he said. "None in this world," replied his superior officer, A. P. Hill. Birdsong was still strong in the air as the men left camp and made their way toward town. From the tower at the Lutheran Seminary, Brigadier General John Buford, a Kentuckian and Union officer, looked out over the town of Gettysburg and beyond at the land that was a series of ridges, like waves in the earth. A faint rain washed the valleys and hills in silver. It was a farmer's rain, gentle and soft. Then, taking up his binoculars, he spotted Major General Heth's troops as they came down the Chambersburg Pike. In a few moments, the early morning quiet was shattered by gunfire. He sent word to General John Reynolds, whose troops were 6 miles away. Rebel infantry attacked at dawn, expecting relief. John Buford. Finishing his hot tea, Abraham fed Enoch, then packed himself a lunch. When he was ready to go, he looked around his cottage. His rocking chair sat next to a small table which he'd made himself, and held his mama's sewing basket. When the old clock chimed 7 times, he put the cat out and the latch on, closed the door, then went out to the barn for Charity. He walked out into a cool, misty rain. He stopped by to tell Mrs. Lightly that he was on his way to Union headquarters to join the ambulance corps. She'd been up since dawn baking bread. The town had been warned that fierce fighting could take place that day in or around Gettysburg. General John Reynolds had sent word suggesting that civilians stay indoors and in cellars if possible. He was particularly concerned about the children. "Charity and me, well, it's like we've been called," Abraham told Mrs. Lightly, accepting 2 loaves of freshly baked bread for his journey. "Please take care of Enoch for me. And if something should happen to me, I'd like for Ladysmith to have my mama's basket." "No," said Ladysmith, coming in from the kitchen. "Don't go. They'll shoot you." She ran into his arms. He hugged her for a moment, then gently released her. "Ain't nobody gonna shoot me," he said. "If I've come this far, I don't expect anybody's aiming for me now." Then he took his leave, turning to look back once. Ladysmith was standing in the road, waving goodbye. After Abraham had left, Mrs. Lightly stood in the kitchen trying to collect her thoughts. "Get your things together," she told Ladysmith, who'd come back inside and was looking out the window to where Abraham had disappeared down the road. "We're going down to the cellar till the fighting's over." She began gathering lanterns, filling them with oil and trimming the wicks. Then she went to fetch a pail for fresh water. Ladysmith rushed up to her room and a minute later rushed back down again. "Enoch!" she cried. "I've got to find Enoch!" And she dashed out of the back door to look for the cat. Out on the Cashtown Road, Lamar was eating breakfast. The food was gone, even eaten in the rain. It was a far cry from the fare the troops had been getting all these months. Pennsylvania is rich land, he thought, and again, raiding parties had done a fine job of providing the best food the surrounding countryside had to offer. He ate heartily of flapjacks, ham, and apple butter, and enjoyed the first real coffee he'd had in months. Until they'd come north, the men had been drinking a vile mixture brewed from parched corn, peanuts, and dried apples. The only resemblance it bore to coffee was the color. "Our thanks to the state of Pennsylvania," said the man sitting next to him, lifting his precious cup of coffee in a mock toast. The tinny sound of a band floated over the camp. Finishing his meal, Lamar walked over to the road to watch the musicians. Down the way he saw a sight that fair lifted his heart. General Robert E. Lee was heading toward them on his tall, dapple-gray horse, Traveler. Troops were gathering along the fence, watching him. A few moved close, reaching out tentative hands to touch the horse. Lee smiled slightly, as if embarrassed by the attention. He raised an arm in salute and removed his soft black hat. The sun broke through the clouds, burnishing his silver hair. Tears rushed to Lamar's eyes so that the general appeared as a figure in a book, misty and outlined in light. Then an officer rode close to the fence, urging the men back. The band struck up the lively strains of Dixie. Lamar was so excited about seeing the general in person that he went back to write a quick letter to Pearl. "Dear Pearl, I seat myself down one time more to let you know that I am in the best of health. I had to tell you what happened today. I saw old Bobby Lee, the general, in person. I don't talk fancy like some others, but I tell you it was like looking at an angel. His hair was shining in the sun, and he looked so fine. Somebody said that while he was sleeping, an entire unit passed by his tent and tippy-toed so as not to waken him. Jen Longstreet will be leading my way to battle this day. I don't aim to worry you none, but Doc Farley's been busy setting up the field hospital for the wounded. I reckon I should be fearful of what's ahead, but Jen Lee never let us down yet. We'll be marching in a little while. Whatever happens, I'll try to make you proud of me. Your faithful brother, Lamar." Rain dripped from the trees onto the brim of Abraham's old straw hat. He felt like he was riding into the eye of a storm. In the dense fog, nothing was familiar. The landscape seemed strange and sinister. Charity's hoofbeats were muffled and thick. He thought about what Ladysmith had said about getting shot. But somehow, he just didn't believe he would be. Something else worried him, though. He knew that some of the whites and most of the blacks in the area had left for fear of being captured by the rebels. He wasn't sure what happened to white prisoners, but he knew that blacks would be sent south and back into slavery if they were caught. He figured he'd rather be shot than caught. When he reached the outskirts of town, the sun broke through buttermilk skies, burning off the fog and promising a hot day. As he drew nearer, there was a rattle of gunfire, then the distant booming of cannonade. Suddenly, a high, thin wailing seemed to rise up out of the earth. Charity pricked up her ears and came to a dead halt. Goosebumps peppered Abraham's arms, and the hairs rose on the back of his neck. The sound was eerie, like a giant animal in pain, but not a real animal, something imagined, something dreaded only in dreams. It was the most terrifying sound he'd ever heard. At the same time Abraham heard it, John Buford heard it up in the tower of the seminary. Only he knew what it was, the rebel yell, issuing from 1,000 throats as they attacked. The rebels were moving rapidly eastward, down the Chambersburg Pike until they topped a rise. There they met Buford's troops and came under Union fire. At 8:30, John Reynolds arrived with his troops. He was a man much admired by both armies. Most men believed he was the best general in the Union Army. He moved his men toward McPherson's Ridge, where they engaged Heth's Confederate troops. Heavy fighting ensued. By mid-afternoon, the Confederates had beaten the Union troops, forcing them south of town to Cemetery Hill. There, Union forces held the high ground. John Reynolds lay dead from a sniper's bullet. The cellar smelled of dust and apples. Dragging her quilt and carrying Enoch in her arms, Ladysmith made her way across the big shadowy room. Her mother lit the lantern and placed it on the wooden table against one wall. In its light, jars of homemade jellies and preserves that lined the shelves glowed like stained glass. Ladysmith glanced around nervously. She was positive there were spiders nearby, and she was scared of spiders. She could practically feel them crawling on the back of her neck. Reaching back, she touched a spider web and jumped. "I hate it down here," she said. The first roar of cannon shook the house and sent dust down from the walls and ceiling. Ladysmith held on to Enoch for dear life. His ears were back and his thick tail twitched nervously. She put her hands over her ears and scooted under the table with him. "They've got no right to do this," she exclaimed. "We haven't done anything." Her mother tried to calm her. "Maybe it won't last long," she said. "We might even go back upstairs to sleep tonight." But Ladysmith wasn't having any of it. She was terrified, and there was nobody to help them. Her daddy was off at war. Abraham had deserted them. And here they were, just waiting to get blown away. Another fierce cannonade shook the house, and Ladysmith curled up in a quilt, pulling it close over her head. Then she said her prayers. At 5:50 that afternoon, the guns on both sides grew still. Confederate troops were busy capturing Union fugitives out of cellars and alleys in the town. Abraham, who had remained hidden in the woods until the fighting in his area ended, now made his way to Union headquarters. This fight, on July 1, had begun over shoes. But the decisions made by junior officers of both armies had committed their commanding generals, Lee on the Confederate side and Meade on the Union, to a battle at Gettysburg. It had not been Lee's intent to fight there, but as the battle unfolded and appeared to be a Confederate victory, he said to General Longstreet, "They, the Union troops, are there in position, and I am going to whip them or they are going to whip me."